This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you, Laura. My name is Anna Vanskoik. I am a librarian at the Hopewell branch for the Mercer County Library System. I'd like to welcome all of you to the program this evening. Before we get started, I do want to share information about an upcoming virtual program. To get into the Halloween spirit, Mercer County Library System is hosting the virtual program How to Hunt the Jersey Devil on Monday, October 21st at 6:30 in the evening. A South Jersey native, Tony DiGirolamo, is going to bring his unique brand of humor to talking about his adventures in the Pines and beyond. And I will put a link to that into the chat so you can register for that event at your leisure after this evening's event. But I do want to make sure to invite you to visit our calendar of events that are where you can locate other virtual program offerings as well as events that are taking place at all 9 of the Mercer County Library System branches. If you simply go to our website, mcl.org, you can go to the events drop down menu and you can find different events that are happening at the different branches as well as our virtual offerings. So for this evening's program, we have Trolleys in the Lawrence Landscape, 1899 to 1940, and it's presented by Dennis P. Waters. Dennis Waters is an author, scientist, and retired internet entrepreneur. His first book, Behavior and Culture in One Dimension, was published by Routledge in 2021. He is a visiting scientist at Rutgers University studying the lichens of central New Jersey, and for 12 years, he was the township historian of Lawrenceville. He represents Lawrence Township on the Mercer County Library Commission. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to you, Dennis. Thank you.
And thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to see so many people who are in trolley mode, as I am. I'm hoping that you can see my screen and that you can see my cursor moving around on the screen. And if that's the case, we can get started. So this evening, I'm going to talk about the competition on what was the most successful suburban trolley route in Mercer County, and that is the Trenton to Princeton route, which carried the most passengers. It was the only suburban route with two lines competing for the same traffic, and it endured the longest of all of the suburban lines. So one of the two lines became known as the Old Line, and the other became known as the Johnson Line. So I'll start with a quick introduction to each to lay out their routes. So first, the Old Line. So this was part of the large trolley system operating from the city of Trenton. As with today's New Jersey Transit buses, Trenton was the transfer point between lines. They had lines reaching out not only to Princeton, but also to Yardville, to Hamilton Square, to West Trenton, and to Pennington and Hopewell. For much of its journey from Trenton to Princeton, the old line traveled along public roads, and as a result, the old line was slower and operated as more of a local. It took 55 minutes to travel from Trenton to Princeton. Also, the old line was strictly for passengers. The tracks were too wide to handle freight cars, but they did allow the trolley cars to be wider and more comfortable. Prior to the extension to Princeton, the farthest extent of the system was Princeton Avenue at Southard Street in Trenton, which is right here. From there, the trolleys turned right at Paul Avenue and then turned left onto Brunswick Avenue and basically followed that which became Lawrenceville Road, today's US 206, into Lawrence. They continued all along Lawrenceville Road through Lawrenceville Village on Main Street, right here. And when they reached the Shippataucan Creek, they turned east and traveled along the south side of Fackler Road until they reached Princeton Pike. Then they traveled along the east side of Princeton Pike until just past the township line, and then they left the roadside and traveled cross country, passing over Stony Brook and the eastern edge of they traveled along Quaker Road a little bit right here, and then they turned toward Princeton along the eastern edge of the Princeton battlefield, the eastern edge of today's Institute for Advanced Study, and the eastern edge of today's Springdale Golf Course. And they intersected with Alexander Road at approximately what is today the traffic light at Faculty Road, and then turned up Alexander Road toward Princeton Borough. And they turned off Alexander at what is today University Place and continued past what is now the old Dinky Station to a trolley siding and waiting room near what is now McCarter Theater. So that's the route of the old line. And now on to the Johnson line, which was quite different. It was not part of the Trenton streetcar system. It ran back and forth between Trenton and Princeton, and that was that. For almost all of its journey, the Johnson line ran across private land. Only at each end, in Trenton and Princeton, did it travel along public roads. And as a result, it was faster and operated as more of an express. It could make the trip in about 35 minutes. Also of importance, its rails were standard gauge and could handle freight cars as well as passenger trolleys. And this is one reason it was eventually acquired by the Reading Railroad. The Johnson line had its Trenton terminal on Hanover Street between Willow and Warren. It followed the public roadway along Hanover and Willow until it crossed Pennington Avenue. There it entered private rights of way and crossed into Ewing, across the west branch of Shabakunk Creek, and through what is today the Prospect Heights neighborhood. It continued on private land all the way into Lawrenceville Village. At one point, it crossed a farm lane that was leading to the farm of Lewis Eggert, and that became known as Eggert's Crossing. In Lawrenceville, it ended up only about 500 feet west of Main Street at its competitor, the Old Line. It continued across more farmland on the way to Princeton, crossing what is now Carter Road, Rosedale Road, Stony Brook, and the Great Road. And entering Princeton, the Johnson line crossed Bayard Lane and then across what is now the parking lot of Community Park, turning back onto the public roadway at Witherspoon Street. The tracks continued down Witherspoon Street to the end of the line at Spring Street, just short of Nassau. I have three quick maps that compare the two routes so that you can see them all in one place. First, this is the way out of Trenton. You can see that they were relatively close in terms of their starting points, but then they began to diverge as they got out of Trenton. Second, here on the Wilderness between Trenton and Princeton, otherwise known as Lawrence. And you can see here that they came very close together in the village of Lawrenceville and then diverged again. And finally, entering Princeton, where the ends of their respective lines were only about half a mile apart. So how did all of this come about? We'll start with the saga of the old line. So in the late 19th century, local transportation infrastructure in our area did leave a lot to be desired. If you wanted to travel from Trenton to Princeton, you would take the stagecoach. Today's US 206 was far and away the best road, but that was not saying much. It only became macadamized in 1895 and would not be paved until the 1920s. Trenton, meanwhile, had had horse-drawn streetcars starting at the time of the Civil War. There was an extensive track system within the city. The first line in Trenton was electrified in 1892 and the entire system by 1894. The Trenton Street Railway Company had ambitions, though, to extend its lines out of the city and into the suburbs. So our story picks up early in 1899. And yes, there were not two, but three trolley companies that were interested in the route. They all realized that the first leg to be built needed to get as far as Lawrenceville Village. The first two competitors, one of which was the Trenton Street Railway, both wanted to operate on the public right-of-way along Lawrenceville Road. Obviously, both could not, so the Lawrence Township Committee had to make a choice, and the winner was the Trenton Street Railway. In February 1899, Lawrence passed an ordinance giving the trolley franchise to the Trenton Streetcar Group, which began building its line out toward the Trenton city limits. Meanwhile, lurking in the background was the third trolley company. The background here is that the New Jersey state law governing street railways said they needed to get not only approval of the local government, the township committee, but also agreement from 51% of the landowners whose property fronted on the roadway in question. So 2 months later, the third trolley company, which is called here the Rival Steam Road, went to court to invalidate the Lawrence Ordinance. Certain of those landowners, it was claimed, had changed their mind and dropped the number below 51%. A few weeks later, they got their injunction and construction was halted. It took a while, but eventually they went back and the original landowner consents were reconfirmed, and the township committee then passed a revised ordinance that was acceptable to the court. Note here that the third trolley line now has a name, Sadler Company. So you should tuck that one away for a future reference. This was the first of what would turn out to be several delays in building the old line to Princeton. Almost 3 months were wasted. The new ordinance laid out the specifications for construction of the trolley line, and it also set fares. 10 cents for a border-to-border ride across Lawrence Township, and 5 cents from Lawrenceville into Trenton. A month later, tracks had been laid out as far as McKinley Hospital, which is now known as Capital Health. And on June 15th, 1899, the trolley made its ceremonial first run all the way into Lawrenceville Village with great excitement and pageantry. Here we see the first trolley parked in front of Hamel House on the Lawrenceville School campus. Regular service to Lawrenceville began the next day. The trolley line was a huge success. In August of 1899, the annual harvest fair at the Presbyterian Church of Lawrenceville drew a record crowd of 2,000, which was more than the population of the township at that time. A month later, the line was extended out Lawrenceville Road as far as Shippatawkin Creek. But by this point, Princeton had made it abundantly clear that there was no way any trolley line was going to come into town along Stockton Street. More on this in a moment. So plan B for the Trenton streetcar group was to travel down Fackler Road and enter Princeton by way of the Princeton Pike. The problem was that in 1899, most of the Princeton Pike was still owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. It had once been a private toll road, and the railroad bought the right of way in order to keep other railroads from competing with the Northeast Corridor. You can see where this is going. The Pennsylvania Railroad was not going to get the trolley company, allow them to use its right of way, so it was on to Plan C. At the end of July in 1899, the Trenton Group chartered a new corporation just to build the line from Lawrenceville to Princeton. The new trolley company was created under a different New Jersey railroad law that granted it limited power of eminent domain. It had the ability to force landowners to sell it rights of way if it came to that. The new plan showed the tracks running along private land parallel to Princeton Pike until just over the township line, whereupon it crossed Stony Brook and set out across farmland. By the end of 1899, by the end of August of 1899, service was in place as far as Stony Brook. By the way, you may see the name Updike on this map here, and part of the Updike land shown on the map became today's Updike Farmstead, which is headquarters of the Historical Society of Princeton. Princeton. I mentioned earlier that Princeton had sent a clear message they did not want the trolley along Stockton Street. Their attitude is neatly summed up in this editorial from the university's alumni publication. To quote, "Another serious objection to the road would be the running of Sunday excursions, which as a matter of course would follow such a move. This would make Princeton more or less of a Sunday resort to all outsiders, an objection that cannot be impressed too forcibly. Our campus would become a picnic ground for the lower element of our neighboring cities, and troubles of various sorts would follow in consequence." Less publicly noted as an objection was the university administration's fear of exactly the opposite, providing Princeton students with easy access to the pleasures of Trenton. Leading the opposition was this man, Moses Taylor Pine. For those of you who may not know him, Pine was a longtime trustee and major benefactor to Princeton University. He has not one, but two campus buildings named for him, as well as the Pine Prize, which is given annually to the university's top undergraduate scholar. He was also a trustee of the Lawrenceville School and a township committeeman in Princeton and the son in law of Major General Robert Stockton. A well connected man. Pine had a private train to take him to New York when he had business there, and he lived right on Stockton Street in a little place called Drumthwacket. Pine was a classic practitioner of what today we call NIMBY, not in my backyard, and he had a big backyard. To Pine, trolleys were just fine as long as they came nowhere near him or his property. In any event, Pine went on a real estate shopping spree to make his backyard even bigger, buying up all of the land anywhere near him that might provide a right of way to the trolley line. This report in the New York Times said he had already bought 3 farms and was trying to buy more. But ultimately, the Trenton Group, with its power of eminent domain, prevailed. In October 1899, a route was negotiated to cross farmland and enter Princeton via Alexander Street, what was then called Canal Street, near the Pennsylvania Railroad freight station. But it still wasn't over. Some landowners refused to sell, and so the matter went back to court. Finally, in late January of 1900, the court forced the owners to sell, and in May of 1900, service began as far as Alexander Road. Next, the trolley company had to go to Princeton Township to get a right of way to run along the short stretch of Alexander to the Princeton Borough line. This approval was finally secured 6 months later, in November of 1900. And finally, in February of 1901, Princeton Borough Council granted the last 2,500 feet of right of way to bring the trolley line to its terminus. Service all the way into Princeton began on April 29th, 1901, almost 2 years after service into Lawrenceville had begun. So it took 2 trips to court, a fight with the Pennsylvania Railroad, and a battle with the aristocracy of Princeton, but the trolley line was finally built. This image is from some years later, but it serves to remind us that the Alexander Street railroad yards of Princeton were very much an industrial zone in the early 20th century. The trolley line ran right along here along the edge of the golf course. This 1926 photo shows the Princeton end of the line with the then new Dinky station right here. The Carter Theater would later be built here, and you can see the tracks right here. So in the final analysis, Princeton was not able to keep the trolley out, but they did manage to keep it from coming in the front door. It came in through the service entrance instead. We can now look at a few images of the old line in operation, starting at the Princeton end and working our way towards Trenton. This is the Princeton terminal in about 1908. This is along Fackler Road, where a farmer picked up some spare change by advertising to trolley riders. This 1922 photo shows the tracks alongside today's 206, heading south toward Lawrenceville. And here the trolley stops in Lawrenceville Village. This is a circa 1915 view with the tracks looking toward the bridge at 5 Mile Run from about the intersection with Dara Lane. And here are the tracks in the Eldridge Park neighborhood. This appears to be Lawn Park Avenue running off here to the side. And finally, here's Paul Avenue in Trenton. Here you can see tracks going both ways. But for most of its route, the old line was single-tracked, which meant that sidings had to be installed to let trolleys traveling in opposite direction pass one another safely. In Lawrence Township, there were 5 siding switches, they sometimes called them junctions, along Lawrenceville Road. The one closest to Trenton was just south of the intersection of Brunswick Avenue and Mulberry Street. and the switch was right here. These diagrams, by the way, date to 1925 when Route 206 was paved for the first time. This switch was near the Shabakunk Creek Bridge, which was right here. The switch is here across from what is today Notre Dame High School. This switch here was across from what is now Rider University. And this switch was between Green Avenue and Titus Avenue in the village. You might be able to read it here. It says trolley switch to be relocated. It was moved a bit further south across from Monroe Avenue, and it remains there today as a bus stop across from the PNC Bank. This little carve out is actually a remnant of the old trolley line. The final switch along Lawrenceville Road was the so-called Cranston Junction, which was not far from today's Cherry Grove Farm. Okay, now we will turn the page and tell the tale of the Johnson line. For this, we need to reset our clocks to 1899. So do we remember the Sadler line? These were the folks who filed that first court challenge to the Trenton Group when they were trying to get to Lawrence. That was back in April of 1899. Their challenge failed, but they began building their own line anyway. Now, the Sadler line was not originally designed to be an electric trolley. It was envisioned to be a steam-powered railroad that could haul both passengers and freight between Trenton and Princeton, and it was headed by a local man called Wilbur Sadler. The Trenton end of the line was not actually in Trenton. It was on Ingham Avenue, right across the Ewing Township line. Needless to say, this was not especially convenient for passengers. Sadler began laying track over private farmland in April 1899, and by July had reached Lawrenceville Village, in reality just a few weeks after the old line had arrived. At first, Sadler was chiefly a freight line, but soon they began running a stagecoach service to bring passengers from downtown Trenton to their terminal on Ingham Avenue. This service ran for about a year, while Sadler and his group began building trolley lines across the river in Bucks County, with plans to connect them to Trenton across the Calhoun Street Bridge. More than a year later, September of 1900, the Sadler line finally started building from Lawrenceville toward Princeton, and they reached as far as Stony Brook by the end of 1900. So at this point, you may be wondering to yourself, wait a minute, I thought this was the Johnson line. What is Sadler doing here? Where is Johnson? Well, in our part of New Jersey, when you hear the name Johnson, you usually think of Robert Wood Johnson and the J&J Johnson family, but these are different Johnsons. Our trolley Johnsons are two brothers from Louisville, Kentucky. Older brother Tom on the left, younger brother Albert on the right. Tom was the practical brother. He was an inventor, a businessman, and ultimately a successful politician, elected to Congress twice and for several terms as the mayor of Cleveland. Albert was the more, shall we say, impractical brother. He liked to dream big dreams. Now, the streetcar lines in Louisville, Kentucky, where the brothers grew up, were owned by the DuPont family, and Tom Johnson went to work for them. And while he was there, he invented a new kind of fare box. It was Tom's idea to put glass around the sides so that the conductor could count how much money had been dropped in. With the proceeds from Tom's invention and a loan from the DuPonts, the Johnsons moved to Indianapolis and took over the streetcar business there. Young Albert joined the company to learn the ropes. Meanwhile, Tom Johnson patented a design for streetcar rails that became the standard for trolley lines all over America. He started a company that had a monopoly on manufacturing trolley rails. Here's the Johnson rail manufacturing plant in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. By 1890, Tom Johnson had joined the 1%. Albert Johnson, meanwhile, was much more interested in building and running trolley systems. From Indianapolis, he branched out to the Lehigh Valley, to Brooklyn, and was even involved in building parts of the London Underground. But he was also interested in baseball. So here in playoff season, we'll take a brief detour to the Baseball Hall of Fame, where we will meet John Montgomery Ward. Ward was a pitcher and shortstop in the mid 1880s, and he later founded what amounted to the first baseball players union, which was called the Brotherhood. As a union leader, he felt the baseball owners were exploiting the players. And after a few more years, he had a brainstorm. Perhaps the players should form their own league, a league of their own, to compete with the existing owners. So in 1889, he founded what became known as the Players League. And off he went in search of investors. And guess who he found? That's right, Albert Johnson. Albert became an early advocate and spokesman for the Players League and was involved in two of the franchises that they proposed for 8 cities in Cleveland and in Brooklyn. So here's Johnson in Cleveland, and here's Johnson in Brooklyn. Albert Johnson's idea was that owning a team and building a stadium were fine things to do, but the real money was to be made in running the streetcar lines to the stadiums. This idea was not original to Albert. As this poster for an old stadium in Cleveland shows, it was built by the streetcar team owner along his trolley line. The 1896 Cleveland Spiders were a pretty good team. In particular, they had this very impressive pitcher called Cy Young. So here's a question. How does the historic link between trolleys and baseball continue to this very day, to this very night? Yes, the Brooklyn Dodgers were originally the Brooklyn Trolley Dodgers, named because of the convergence of trolley tracks near Ebbets Field. Well, anyway, John Montgomery Ward's Players League did not make it past its first season, and Albert Johnson returned to his streetcar businesses. He moved to Brooklyn. He was making a lot of money there, but he had even grander plans for New York. In early 1901, Albert announced that he wanted to build a trolley line connecting New York and Philadelphia. He would cross Staten Island, tunnel under the Narrows to Brooklyn, and then under the East River to Manhattan. He was basically laughed out of Brooklyn. His plan even warranted an editorial in the New York Times, and not an especially favorable one. They said, Mr. Johnson is very voluble. He talks about 10 times as much as serious and responsible men are in the habit of doing when engaging in large enterprises. Nonetheless, Albert persevered and began trying to assemble the pieces of his Philadelphia to New York trolley line. And for piece number one, the Johnson brothers bought Wilbur Sadler's Trenton to Princeton steam line, along with all of the Sadler holdings in Bucks County and the Calhoun Street Bridge. And they kept on Sadler. Here's old Wilbur Sadler himself to manage the system. The Johnsons immediately began planning to electrify the system and complete the line into Princeton, and then suddenly something quite unexpected happened. In July of 1901, Albert died at the age of 41. So just as John A. Roebling did not survive long enough to see the completion of the Brooklyn Bridge, so Albert L. Johnson never lived to see the completion of the trolley line that was to bear his name in Mercer County. It fell to Tom Johnson to try to sort out the pieces of Albert's trolley empire. In August of 1901, construction began to extend the line from Stony Brook into Princeton. In November 1901, the first trolley reached the foot of Witherspoon Street. In May of 1902, construction began to bring the line down Witherspoon from the Princeton borough border, and the first trolley ran to downtown Princeton July 17, 1902. This was about a year after the old line had arrived. But the trip was faster, and the fare was just 10 cents to Trenton, as opposed to the old line, which was slower and charged 30 cents for the same trip. Thus began a decades-long price war that ultimately damaged the financial viability of both trolley lines. But there was still work to do at the Trenton end. Remember that the line only went as far as Ingham Avenue. Passengers had to take a stagecoach from there to get into downtown Trenton. In August 1902, they requested permission to build their line down to Hanover Street. And by November of 1902, they had got as far as Willow and Pennington Avenue, which was close enough for them to discontinue their stagecoach service. Progress on the rest was slow. They had to build a new bridge across the D&R Canal, and building across the tracks of other railroads and other trolley lines was always perilous, often resulting in fights, sometimes in riots. But a year later, November 1903, they began service to downtown Trenton with two new car barns, one at Willow and one at Hanover. And now for a few images of Johnson trolleys. Here's a trolley in Princeton arriving at the Witherspoon Street terminus. This shows a freight car, because they were carrying freight, also in Princeton, and another trolley approaching Spring Street. Here we see a car crossing Bayard Lane, and here the siding along the Princeton Borough border. These houses that you can see in the background here are on Witherspoon Street. Here's a car crossing Stony Brook, and here is the stop in Lawrenceville Village on James Street. This aerial photo shows the tracks coming through Lawrenceville. This building here was the trolley waiting room for the Johnson line, which was built in 1901. Here a trolley cruises past Ingham Avenue in 1938. Here is the Willow Street car barn in 1939. And this is where the car barn was located. This is Willow here, and this is Pennington Avenue down here, so this was the northwest corner. Here you see a car turning from Hanover onto Willow, and here is the car barn on Hanover Street. This is a Princeton trolley on the left, and the other two were bound for Bucks County versus the Calhoun Street Bridge. And this is the location of the Hanover Street terminal, which was just west of Warren Street. The trolley lines were part of everyday life here for the better part of 3 decades. Some of the effects were simple but important. In 1900, for example, the old line began bringing the mail and newspapers out to Lawrenceville. The trolleys were important to the local student populations in Princeton and in Lawrenceville. Their most profitable days were the days of Lawrenceville or Princeton football or baseball games. And as you can see from this notice in the Princeton student newspaper, less than a week after the old line reached Princeton Borough, it was already in use to transport students out to Lawrenceville. Getting enough power to keep the trolleys running smoothly was always a problem. In 1902, the old line had to install a storage battery station near the corner of Princeton Pike and Province Line Road. In 1912, this was upgraded to a booster generator. In 1909, the Johnson line built a substation on the Lawrenceville-Pennington Road and brought in a 13,000-volt line to connect with their main power plant in Yardley. That building is still here today. Around the same time, Tom Johnson, who was by then mayor of Cleveland, gave up on Albert's trolley lines and sold everything off. The Johnson line was taken over by a Bucks County group, who in turn sold it to the Reading Railroad in 1929. Nonetheless, some of the worst fears of Princeton came true. The university campus became a weekend destination for Trentonians. Said the Daily Princetonian in 1901, the campus on pleasant afternoons and evenings, particularly on Sunday, is filled with people who have come here on the trolley. On Decoration Day last year, it will be remembered the campus was turned into a semi-picnic ground, and we had the pleasure of seeing these people parading up and down the walks, making themselves very much at home. If this is allowed to continue, our commencement evenings will be utterly spoiled by having so undesirable a crowd mingling with our guests, and the Princeton campus will become no more or less than a public park for Trenton. And the worst fears of Princeton also came to pass. Trenton became a weekend destination for Princeton University students. as evidenced by this ad in the Daily Princetonian. And this place was especially handy if you missed the last trolley back to Princeton and needed to sleep it off. But Trenton was not the only draw. Lawrenceville had its attractions as well. One farmer on Van Kirk Road ran a still and was a key supplier to Princeton students during Prohibition. They would take the Johnson line out to Van Kirk to pick up their hooch and return to campus. But the trolleys were important to more modest scholars as well. They brought high school students to Trenton and to Princeton in the days long before Lawrence High School, and also provided transportation within Lawrence. Because of its proximity to the trolley lines, the Lawrenceville Elementary School had a large number of its students arriving by trolley. The school district began buying trolley tickets in bulk in 1912. And in its last few years, the Johnson line relied on student fares for income. It had become a de facto school bus. And then there were operational issues. The trolleys did not play well in the snow. In 1913, for example, a Johnson trolley was stranded in a blizzard for an entire week. All of the passengers walked to a nearby farmhouse and stayed there until the tracks could be cleared. And then there were the inevitable accidents, especially in the early days before people and horses got used to the idea that these fast moving machines could come zooming out of nowhere. And with crude signaling systems, trolleys were prone to colliding with one another rather than using the sidings. One of the most memorable crashes occurred February 20th, 1917, when two old line cars collided along Princeton Pike near the township line. But perhaps the longest lasting effect of the trolleys on life in Lawrence was the beginning of suburbanization. It was the trolleys that first allowed Lawrence to become a suburb of Trenton. You could work in Trenton, but live in Lawrence. As this chart shows, our population was holding steady at about 1,500 for 1890 and 1900. By 1930, however, it had quadrupled to over 6,000, and most of these newcomers settled in new subdivisions along the trolley lines. The first such subdivision was created in 1906. A Boston developer bought 42 acres from a South Lawrence farmer called Stephen Eldridge, and Eldridge Park was born. Eldridge Avenue stretched from the old line at its eastern end to the Johnson line at its western end. The same developer then marketed Trenton Terrace. This section, however, was only on the Johnson trolley line and was literally on the other side of the tracks. In 1911, the farmers along the Lawrenceville Road began to catch real estate fever. Lawrenceville Manor was subdivided along the old line on the opposite side of the road from Eldridge Park. The trolley lines hit their peaks of ridership in the early 1920s. It's hard to believe today, but in 1921, the Johnson line carried 1.6 million fares. But as automobiles became more popular, the trolleys became less so. Interestingly, what really sealed the fate of the trolleys was not so much the automobile itself, it was the road improvements that drivers demanded to make driving faster and more pleasant. In 1925, Lawrenceville Road was paved for the first time. Main Street in the village was widened and the trolley tracks were moved to the center of the street. This cost the old line a lot of money at a time when ridership was already declining. In addition, road improvements made it possible to introduce safe and reliable bus service, which was also more economical to operate. The suburban trolley line between Pennington and Hopewell was first to go, replaced with buses in 1924. In 1929, the New Jersey Department of Transportation announced that it was going to install a traffic circle at Brunswick Avenue on the Trenton-Lawrence border, right where the old line ran. Since they couldn't move the track so that it would follow the circle, the trolley continued to run right through the middle of the circle. So if you went all the way around, you would cross the tracks twice. Under pressure from the state DOT, in 1931, Trenton Transit announced it would replace the trolley with buses between the Trenton border at Mulberry Street and Fackler Road in Lawrence, where passengers would then board the trolley again for the ride into Princeton. Ironically, the same Princeton that had fought so hard to keep the trolleys out of town was now fighting to retain the trolleys and avoid those nasty buses. The bus lines were told they could run through Princeton only if they did not open the bus doors while there. The final trolley of the old line ran down Main Street in Lawrenceville on July 26, 1931. Later in that year, Princeton finally relented, and the last trolley into the borough ran on December 29th. From 1932 on, it was buses, what was then called the P line for Princeton, through many changes of ownership from Trenton Transit to Capital Transit to Mercer Metro and now New Jersey Transit, where the 606 bus carries on the tradition. By the end of 1934, all of the Trenton Transit streetcars had given away to buses. And here you can see them removing old line tracks north of Lawrenceville around 1932. Emboldened by the success of Trenton Transit in closing down its trolley system and with annual ridership down to 380,000 fares, most of those students, in 1934, the Reading Railroad requested permission to close down the Johnson line. Permission was denied. Since the Johnson line ran for the most part over farmland, it had managed to avoid a lot of the road improvement conflicts of the old line. But in 1939, it was hit with a double whammy. Trenton announced a plan to repave Willow Street. Rather than rebuild its tracks, the Johnson line abandoned the tracks and moved its terminus back out to the car barn at Willow and Pennington Avenue. On July 31st, 1939, the last Johnson trolley left the Hanover Street terminal. And in fact, this was the last trolley ever to operate on the streets of Trenton. The same year, Princeton Borough announced plans to repave Witherspoon Street, and the Johnson line's response was the same. They moved their terminus back out to the foot of Witherspoon. In 1936, in order to cut costs, service was reduced from 20 daily trips down to 13. With ridership now under 300,000 and the Trenton Princeton stations much more inconvenient, the Reading went back to request permission to abandon the line, and in July 1940 they finally got it, with the provision that the line remain open for diesel freight service as far as Lawrenceville. On Halloween night in 1940, the last trolley left Trenton for Princeton and returned shortly after midnight. Between Princeton and Lawrenceville, all of the tracks were taken up and the wires came down. Between Trenton and Lawrenceville, however, the Reading Railroad continued to operate the line for freight service with several deliveries a week of coal and grain. This 1963 aerial photo shows the line and its two major stops here and here. One was the Lawrenceville Ice and Coal Company, today Lawrenceville Fuel. They were the local supplier of heating coal. This is Gordon Avenue right here, and this is James Street. Until 1968, the Lawrenceville School was heated by coal and was a major customer for the railroad. These 1960 diagrams show the positions of the tracks in Lawrenceville Village. This shows the tracks coming in, double tracked here, crossing Gordon Avenue and into the coal yard. And here is the crossing at Phillips Avenue and James Street, the corner where the old Johnson Trolley passenger station was still standing here. But coal use was declining, and by the early 1970s, there was only one customer left on the line, and that was the feed and grain mill on Lawrenceville-Pennington Road. Once known as the Mercer Feed Company in 1963, it was sold to Walter Zydak. The building is now a housing complex called the Village Mill. This was Zydak's feed company. This was the power station for the Johnson line over Caddy Corner from the intersection of Lawrenceville-Pennington Road. But once again, history was to repeat itself, and road improvements sealed the fate of the Lawrenceville branch. The New Jersey Department of Transportation was constructing I-295 through Lawrence. This image is looking west from the interchange at Route 206. Here you can see the tracks. They're going across right here. And here is Danow Road, the old alignment, and it was being realigned so it would all be on one side of 295. NJDOT had budgeted $2 million to build an overpass that would take the highway over the railroad line. But when they found out that the Reading Railroad had only one customer on the line, they persuaded Reading to abandon it. The persuasion was apparently in the form of a $10,000 check. This put the Zydak feed mill out of business, but it saved the state $2 million. January 26, 1973, saw the last freight delivery to the feed mill and was the last time railroad wheels rolled down those tracks. Between Trenton and Princeton, there are still plenty of places where evidence of the trolley line persists. So we'll take a little tour, starting with the old line. This is the US 206 bridge across Shabakunk Creek near Notre Dame High School. You can clearly see the abutments from the old line bridge on the east side of the road. And as we saw earlier, just north of Lawrenceville-Pennington Road is a bus stop cutout that was once the location of an old line siding. Here in the back 40 of the Lawrenceville School, someone repurposed an abandoned rail. The remnants of the trolley bridge across Shippatawkin Creek can be seen adjacent to the Fackler Road Bridge. Both the abutments and the pier are visible. And the same is true for Stony Brook. The abutments and pier of the Stony Brook Bridge are still there and are readily seen from Princeton Pike when the trees are bare. The Historical Society of Princeton is in possession of some old line rails that turned up during an archaeological survey of their Updike farmstead. The hiking trail that begins at the Princeton Friends School and continues behind Princeton Battlefield follows the old line right-of-way. It travels through the Institute Woods and emerges at Olden Lane. Bridge abutments can still be seen at the Springdale Golf Course near the 10th hole. And finally, the Princeton waiting room for the old line has been repurposed by the university. It's now the headquarters of their conference and event services. The platform was over here, parallel to a University Place, as you can see here. So that's what's left of the old line. Well, that's almost all that's left of the old line. I'll have more to say about that in a few minutes. And now back to Trenton to trace the Johnson line. At the northwest corner of Hanover and Willow is an old trolley pole. You can see it here. In fact, it is almost certainly the same pole seen here in this 1930s photograph of the intersection. Here's a close-up of that pole, and here's the pole still standing. Much of the right-of-way between Trenton and Lawrenceville is still visible because it was used for freight until 1973. That's only 50 years ago. In Ewing, here's the bridge across the west branch of Shabakunk Creek, right off of the Home Depot parking lot on Olden Avenue. And until recently, the only remaining tracks crossed Olden Avenue at 5th Street in Ewing in the Prospect Heights neighborhood. But now, after 50 years, they've finally been paved over. The right-of-way is used as a trail north of Spruce Street in Ewing. This is Stout's Bus Company here on the right. The trail crosses into Lawrence over the east branch of Shabakunk Creek and continues on the Harold Vereen Walkway, a paved bike trail along Johnson Avenue through the Eggerts Crossing neighborhood. And here is the original Eggerts Crossing. The trail continues behind Rider University, where this bridge was recently built using the original abutments from the trolley bridge across 5 Mile Run. Now we have to hop across I-295. On the north side, the trail continues into Lawrenceville Village. This here is Danow Road. At Lawrenceville-Pennington Road, you can see the building that used to be the Johnson Line Power Substation. Here is some detail showing the entrance ports for electrical wiring. This building has subsequently been painted white. In the village, this was the old Johnson Line waiting room built in 1901 and which has recently been restored by its owner to look much like it used to in the day of the trolley. The trolley right of way crosses Lawrence Township property off Bergen Street, north of Cold Soil Road, and then it crosses Shippatawkin Creek. The old bridge was right here. You can see the bridge abutment dated 1931 on the familiar Reading Railroad diamond. The right of way continues on private land, crossing Van Kirk Road near the Terhune Pick Your Own Apple Orchard, and continuing up this driveway. It crosses Stony Brook near the Johnson Park Elementary School in Princeton, not the Johnson Trolley Johnsons, mind you. And as you're standing there, you can try to imagine what it looked like during the days of the trolley. The abutments and piers can still be seen from the school driveway. The Johnson right-of-way is now a bike path behind the school connecting out to Elm Road, and it picks up again on the bike path next to Community Park and then through the parking lot. As our Johnson Line tour began with a pole in Trenton, so it ends with a pole in Princeton on Witherspoon Street, opposite Quarry Street, right next to the cemetery. Now, I know this is a history talk, but I would like to close with a few words about the future of trolleys in Lawrence. In Lawrenceville, there are 3 historic plaques about the Johnson Trolley Line. They're all the same. One at Craven Lane, one at Lawrenceville Pennington Road, and one at Eggert's Crossing. Unfortunately, they are deteriorating, but the township, in cooperation with the Lawrence Hopewell Trail, will soon replace them with 3 new markers to help tell the story, so keep your eyes open for those. Today, several miles of the Johnson Line have been transformed into walking and cycling trails in Ewing, Lawrence, and Princeton. Even a piece of the Lawrence Hopewell Trail follows the Johnson right-of-way, and the possibility exists that more can be done. Local and state officials are looking to develop what they are calling the Johnson Trolley Trail Corridor. You can find out more about this on the Mercer County website in the planning department for the Johnson Trolley Trail, this URL right here. The idea is to use parts of the old right-of-way and adjacent thoroughfares to create a safe passage for cyclists, runners, and pedestrians. Part of the plan would be to undo what was done in 1973 by building a bicycle and pedestrian bridge over I-295 to reconnect the northern and southern sections of the trolley right-of-way. And finally, talking about the future, you may know some of the tale of car number 288 of the old line. In 2018, developers bought a property in Hamilton with the intention of tearing down the existing house and building something new. And as they were demolishing the existing house, they discovered that in fact it had been built around an old trolley car, car 288 from the Trenton Transit line. Fortunately, they stopped their demolition and contacted a historic railroad group here in New Jersey. And these folks came and fetched the old car and moved it to a site near the shore where it could be restored. That restoration is now underway, and in the not too distant future, Trenton Car 288 will look as good as new, and new was in 1914. So what is to become of Car 288? It's early days, but there are plans afoot to try to build a new trolley museum in Lawrenceville to serve as a permanent home. This would be on Gordon Avenue on the site of what is now Lawrenceville Fuel. So stay tuned. So I think we'll leave it there. Thank you for being here. And thank you once again to the many people and organizations who have helped me with the research. And now, if you have some questions, I would be happy to try to answer them.
Thank you so much, Dennis. There is one question that's already come through. You mentioned a subdivision named Lawrenceville Manor. Can you say more about where that was specifically? It doesn't ring a bell for one of our attendees uh, as a common name for a neighborhood now.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's still being used as a neighborhood name. This is the area that's on the east side of 206 in the Eldridge Park area. So south of, oh boy, I'm having a senior moment here. The road that goes across to the high school and south of the Lawrence Road Fire Company. So that neighborhood back in there was originally marketed as Lawrenceville Manor.
And someone is asking about whether this is being recorded. It is being recorded, and we will post it onto our YouTube channel, the Mercer County Library System's YouTube channel, and I will send a link out to that so that you will be able to access that at your leisure. Because I know that I kind of want to go back and revisit some aspects of it. The images that you found of the remnants, I think, are really fascinating. Some of them I definitely have seen. Were those pictures that you went out and took yourself, or did you collect those through historical archives?
No, those are pretty much. I think they're all pictures I took myself. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would mention that the library YouTube channel is building an archive of a lot of these talks that I have given online for the past several years. When I was township historian, I had made a habit annually of giving a talk to the annual meeting of the Lawrence Historical Society. And to sort of capture that information, we're trying to redo a couple of those talks every year with the library system, and they are being recorded and being filed away. So there are a number of these already on the library system YouTube channel. Do you have that? Do you have that URL that you can put up there, Anna, by any
I can
chance?
do that. Yeah, let me get that for you real quick
So if you want to
here.
see some of the other ones, there, and as well as other history lectures that are given through the library system, they do a great job with this.
And then one person asks about, did Moses Taylor Pine save Princeton Battlefield to push the trolley away from his backyard?
That's a good question. I honestly don't know. The Princeton Battlefield Society would probably know more about the history of exactly how that land came to be preserved. That was a little bit away from where Pine was, but he was buying up a lot of property in that general vicinity, so I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case, but I can't confirm it.
And then someone was asked, was public service coordinated transit involved with these lines?
Public Service, which is our beloved power company, operated a trolley system that ran between Trenton and New Brunswick, and so that was a little bit to the east of here, and it was to the east of what is now Route One. So it was not connecting Lawrenceville, Princeton, and Trenton. It was really out in the countryside, sort of through Clarksville and Grover's Mill and places like that.
And then another person asks, are there any signs of the trolley left on Fackler Road? And also, you're getting lots of thank yous and kudos and much appreciation. I don't know if you can see that or not, Dennis, but I did want to let you know that.
The the only thing you'll see at Fackler Road is the are the abutments from the old bridge across Shippatawkin Creek. So if you're on the Fackler Road Bridge, you can see, and you're driving from 206 toward Princeton Pike, you would see them on the right hand side of the bridge. The I wouldn't be surprised if excavations were done along
Mm.
Fackler Road that you wouldn't find some artifacts, but there's kind of a small berm along there where the trees are piled up. Part of that is county property. Maybe we can convince the county to do something there sometime.
And then there was a question about one of the images that you had shown in the program. It was with the old line, it was back earlier. and I think it was the image where it was along Dara Lane, and there was a sign on a tree that said L. It looked like a big L. Was that some type of indicator for the trolley line?
That was actually a sign for the Lincoln Highway,
Oh,
which was which is a whole nother lecture, let me
that's
tell
a
you.
whole nother thing.
Actually, that's actually I think that we did do the lecture on the history of Route 206, and I believe
Yes.
that's on the YouTube channel. So if you want to know all about that, that is in that lecture. But yeah, that was a sign that was posted for the Lincoln Highway, of which our precious 206 was a part of that in the very early part of the 20th century. That was really the first coast to coast automobile highway in the United States.
And as Dennis mentioned, that talk is on our YouTube channel, and I can send out the link directly to that talk specifically in the follow-up to the to our participants. But that is another fascinating talk. Dennis, that's all the questions that we've gotten. Thank you so much for such an informative talk. And I do want to
Thank
thank
you for
Laura,
having me.
absolutely. And I have to thank Laura, who was behind the scenes. And actually, it looks like she helped you with your presentation as well. She got some kudos there at the end
Oh, yes.
in your presentation. And I want to thank everyone for attending this evening, and I do hope to see you at upcoming programs. Have a good night, everybody.
Okay.